Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Media's New Deal, presented by Oxford Road. Media's New Deal is a limited run series designed to help you adapt your advertising and leverage current market conditions to help you come out of this crisis stronger than you were before. I'm your host, Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road. Welcome to Media's New Deal. Now this week we're going to do things a little bit differently. I've got a guest host here, Mr. Giles Martin, EVP of Client Strategy and Insights here at Oxford Road. He's our foremost expert on today's topic, which is centered around data. Giles is an Oxford grad and actually the most legitimate part about our name, Oxford Road. And he's worked on a number of prestigious brands, but most importantly, Giles is British. So welcome, Giles.
Thank you.
So there's been a lot happening this week, obviously with Joe Rogan moving over to Spotify. That's been the talk of the town for a week or so here. And, I think this is a big milestone. So it's going to be really interesting to get Dave's perspective, our guest coming up, on what this means to the numbers, by the numbers. But before we do that, Giles, would you do us the honor of performing today's first live read? I just think it'll sound better coming from you.
Pleasure, Dan. Happy, before we get started, to tell you about one of our sponsors. This week's episode is brought to you by Bambi. When running a business, HR issues make the difference between success and failure. Wrongful termination suits, minimum wage requirements, labor regulations, and HR manager salaries aren't cheap, an average of $70,000 a year. Bambi, spelled B-A-M-B-E-E, was created specifically for small business. You can get a dedicated HR manager, craft HR policy, and maintain your compliance, all for just $99 a month. With Bambi, you can change HR from your biggest liability to your biggest strength. Your dedicated HR manager is available by phone, email, or real-time chat. From onboarding to terminations, they customize your policies to fit your business and help you manage your employees day to day, all for just $99 a month. Month to month, no hidden fees, cancel anytime. You didn't start your business because you wanted to spend time on HR compliance. Let Bambi help. Get your free HR audit today. Go to bambi.com/Oxford right now to schedule your free HR audit. That's bambi.com/Oxford, spelled BAMBEE.com/Oxford.
Giles, that was really good. But what I want to know is, how do you feel about Bambi?
I feel they are the best solution for anyone in this space, and I strongly advocate their use.
I feel the same way. And to be honest, we went years without proper HR support. Yeah. And this is the thing that would have been a dream, as we were building up this business, and to get all that support and have that peace of mind at $99 a month, a very good investment. Yeah, thank you. Today's guest is Dave Zohrob, co-founder and CEO of Chartable.com, the podcast measurement company. Chartable helps advertisers measure the effectiveness of their ads and helps podcasters understand and grow their audiences, tracking over 9,000 podcasts a month. He's doing the very important and difficult work of trying to take the measurement practice in podcasts out of the Wild West and into the future. Every marketer that I know struggles with attribution, and he's not only bringing a solution, but he's also getting a profound level of visibility into the marketplace. In other words, Dave is on a very short list of people who have a dashboard that speaks to the performance of ads and programs across the podcast industry. So I'm really excited for what he's going to be able to share with us today, and particularly in this present environment. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Okay, so let's kick it off. Tell us a little bit about your journey into the podcast world. How'd you get here, and why Chartable?
It's a long story. I'll try to make it shorter. So I've, always loved podcasts. I've listened for a long time. I had some background in radio. I did college radio. My mom did college radio, both at the University of Michigan.
Like you were a jock?
Station. Yeah, man. I was a music director of my radio station.
Okay.
But fast forward, was a listener for a long time. My co-founder and I were working together at a startup called AngelList. We both, even though we're not strapping young startup founders anymore, wanted to give it another shot. We both started companies before and wanted to do it again. And so we left our cushy jobs and made a list of things we thought were interesting. And we're like, hey, let's just try some different ideas and see what we can come up with. And podcasting was really high up on that list. And as soon as we started digging into it, I've always been a listener, like I said, but like just kind of trying to understand. Never really thought about it from a technical or business perspective. Just thought like, hey, here's this cool app on my phone. I open it up. There's great stuff in there. It's free. That's awesome. Right. But we started just kind of exploring the tech and business side and just, fell down the rabbit hole and never came out. Right. It was like, this is a market that was like so interesting and unique and complex. And, we were, of course, like as nerds, like as a programmer, I was like, oh, I'm going to make a podcast app. Right.
Yeah.
But after talking to listeners as part of our like research process, I was like, oh, that's dumb. I'm not going to do that.
Nobody knows how to measure it. Right?
Yeah. So
what year did you actually launch a company?
So we left our jobs in 2017 and Chartable started in 2018.
Very good. And when did you actually start listening to podcasts?
The first time was like back in 07,
Ooh.
06, 07. Yeah. Like
early adopter.
Well, I wasn't a steady listener at that point. I'd heard about some of the Twit stuff, like this Odeo, which is like the company that predated Twitter, was a podcast directory. They, I was living in San Francisco working at a startup and they were like borrowing server space from us. So I was like, oh, what's this podcast thing? Right. But I wasn't really a steady listener until, the obvious moment, which is Serial, right?
Serial, of course.
So I can't claim any other, long time status other than having dabbled, 7 or 8 years prior to that.
All right. So the big news in the last week is obviously Rogan. Everybody's talking about it. What's your point of view? What does this mean to everybody?
I think this is a huge deal. I mean, obviously it's a huge deal. Rogan's, top of the charts, top of everything. And this to me just shows like how seriously Spotify is making this play of aggregating listeners. They're just putting so much money behind it. It means that like they're betting a huge chunk of the company on it. And I think that's in a lot of ways speaks to the power of the medium, but it also, I think, points out some potential, dangers on the road for folks that are not Spotify, because like right now, so much of what's great about podcasting relies on its being an open ecosystem. But if Spotify is able to pull everyone into their proprietary platform, then we're going to see kind of a withering of this crazy, wonderful open ecosystem that's been out there. So it's awesome because it's going to be even more people are aware of podcasting, hopefully, after Spotify puts their muscle behind it. But it also is, potentially scary for folks that rely on the independent ecosystem being a thing.
Could you say more about how you feel the open ecosystem benefits, the industry generally, and what you think the potential implications could be of this trend?
Yeah, so podcasting is just so unique in media because there's really no gatekeepers from the production side or the publishing side or the consumption side. You can put out a podcast on any different number of hosting platforms or put it up on a server in your bedroom if you wanted to. And you can listen to podcasts on so many different kinds of apps, on so many different kinds of devices. And it's not just dictated by one tech company saying, here's what you can do with this audio, right? And that, to me, has led to a flourishing of a bunch of different, the fact that I can make a show or you can make a show and it goes into the same app that ESPN and the New York Times go into, and it's like as easily accessible is a pretty amazing thing. Of course, with that openness comes challenges, like measurement is one of the great challenges of this open ecosystem because there's so many different ways to consume. But, given the trade-offs, like it's been kind of an incredible thing that in 2020, after all this tech consolidation, that there's still this like open ecosystem where anyone can publish something and have the same reach to a consumer that these megacorps have.
Yeah, I used to get into arguments with some of the publishers like iHeart because when they first started getting into podcasts, they would gate it and say, well, you can only listen through the iHeart app, right? And it was such a mistake at the time because they needed that reach, they needed that scale. But what's interesting is to see the pendulum going to one side and starting to come back again. so they can exercise that control. It's going to be very interesting to see. Very interesting.
It's a very interesting time. Yeah.
So back to Chartable. Can you just give us the elevator pitch real quick on what you guys do and how you do it?
Yeah, so Chartable is an analytics and attribution company. We measure the listener journey in podcasting, whether that's from the web to a podcast, helping you grow a show, from a podcast to another podcast, measuring how well your promotion is working that way, or from a podcast back out to the web. So advertising analytics. Did somebody who heard the ad for the mattress end up buying the mattress?
Do people advertise mattresses on podcasts?
I've heard they do.
So going back to, what the end user is dealing with, we came into this business and it was like, oh, podcast, it's new, it's innovative, it should be technologically sophisticated. And when we got here, it's like, what? This is harder than anything, right? And so how does what you're doing compare to what the other ways, and let's keep this focused on advertisers, because really this is a podcast for marketers. Tell us about what the options have been and what the alternatives are, and why your solution is important in that spectrum.
Yeah, for sure. So the classic podcast attribution method is basically like offline attribution, like you would do for anything, like for a Subway ad. You go to the website, you put in the coupon code that says, hey, I heard it on the Daily or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like when I zoom out, it's like, okay, that's weird because that would work for a billboard, but podcasts aren't a billboard. They're digital media, right? And so
sort of, yeah.
Well, yeah, sort of. They're not like Facebook, right? Facebook knows everything that you do and every website that you visit. So podcasts aren't Facebook, but they're also not a billboard, right? So they're somewhere in between. And, using the data that is available, we are able to provide a better picture of the performance of an advertisement than just the billboard code. It's not going to be what Facebook does because, we don't have that panopticon of the world. But it is better than just a coupon code. And
that was a $10 word. Can you define that one for us here?
A panopticon, I think I honestly don't know where the word comes from, and maybe it's a sci-fi thing. It means like you can the all-seeing eye, right? Isn't that what a panopticon is? I'm gonna have to get a
panopticon. No, it's fine. Continue, please.
So coupon codes have served pretty well, and a lot of people have done very well with them. I'm sure you guys have great models for how to use a coupon code. What we try to do is to get a little bit further down into measuring the behavior of not just like how many people that heard the ad went to the website. So we can measure like that response rate, which is cool. And it's another data point along with the coupon code. But even further than that is trying to isolate the effect of the podcast ad, what we call incremental lift, right? So we take the folks that were exposed to the ad and we compare them to a control group that were not exposed to the ad. And we run them both against like the website or app traffic and say, okay, well, the people that weren't exposed to the ad, some of them are still going to end up buying the mattress because you're not only advertising on podcasts, right? So we're really trying to statistically isolate the effect of the podcast buy. And that's kind of the newest thing that we've been working on. We're really excited about it. We think it's a big step forward for marketers. Yes, there are other options out there. I'm not going to name my competitors. You can. We think that what we do is pretty great, and we take it super seriously, and we care a lot about it. And I'm sure other folks do too, but that's what I can speak to for ourselves.
But you guys care the most, right?
Yeah, I care a lot.
We're the data company that really cares, right?
Yeah. So we're IAB certified, right? So we went through that whole process, which was
everybody understands that really well, by the way.
Yeah. Well, we were like, I thought as a arrogant nerd that like it would be really easy to go through this thing. It was actually incredibly arduous, and they were really serious about making sure that we counted properly. So it does mean something when a company says that they're IAB certified. It's crazy. It's crazy the hoops you have to go through. And you know what? I came out of that process with a much greater respect for the certification. But more than that, like we also, I know this podcast focused for advertisers, but we do offer like kind of an integrated suite of tools that also benefits publishers, right? So we see it as being two sides of the same coin, right? Without publishers, there's nothing to advertise on. Without advertisers, most publishers can't build a business. So we're serving both sides here, and we think that there's a lot of overlap in creating kind of new and exciting tools that leverage data for publishers and advertisers.
And do you get any visibility into the business when a company advertiser that's been using promo codes, vanity URLs, and surveys, right? That's been kind of the baseline for everybody. When you compare the response you track with the survey data that they're getting, do you find that they're usually under or over counting?
Usually they're undercounting, which is great news for the business. And that's part of the thesis, like why we got into that portion of what we do in the first place, is that we thought, hey, this medium is like so powerful and we know it, right? Everybody has this feeling. And you know, if you have your podcast bingo card out, you'll check the boxes for like the intimacy of the host read advertisement, and like you feel like the hosts are your friends. And of course, like we thought these things are powerful, and the offline attribution methods and promo codes, et cetera, indicated some of that. But really, we see a much greater effect than most folks see with just the offline based methods.
Dave, one thing that's really important for our audience is I think a lot of them are listening, but this one is particularly important to watch on YouTube so that they can see how perfectly you matched your microphone with your shirt.
I didn't quite realize it'd be on YouTube. I might have changed my background.
No, I think it's wonderful. Are we in is that Northern California or Ireland? Where?
This was the Windows XP default background from the early 2000s.
Beautiful pasture. I mean, if you're listening to this, you are really missing out.
I'm practicing my social distancing, as you can see.
Yes, for sure. Well done. And Giles and I actually happen to be in the same hallway with the same neon sign behind us at the same time. Can you believe that?
That's wild.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Well, you guys must have. Wait, so you have two of those signs in there, or just one?
That's correct. No, we put two in there so we could do this interview and have brand consistency. So, Dave, back to business here. You do have a couple competitors. I'll just say Barometric, Pod Sites, Chartable, all kind of rushed in, seems like 18, 19, and all of a sudden we're trying to make, podcasts, which is very, very difficult to measure, a lot more like digital. So how do you guys line up? How do you compare Chartable to the other solutions that are going for the same outcome?
A lot of what we do is similar, but like I said, we're the only IAB certified ones, analytics and attribution solution out there. So I think that matters a lot. It's like, don't just believe us that our numbers are good, right? We actually went through this crazy process. On top of that, there are some differences in methodology and stuff like that. And we could, I don't know how wonky you want to get. For us, like the incremental lift is the thing that we think is going to be a huge differentiator for us. It's really about isolating that effect of the particular campaign on the listener behavior. And, we've had the good fortune of working with folks like yourselves and other folks in the industry. It's like we do this stuff not because we think we're so like all knowing. We have no panopticon. We do it because like we work with great folks and they're like, hey, panopticon lists.
Yeah.
We work with great folks they're helping us, they're pointing us in the right direction. So we're constantly building, experimenting, and making better things here.
Dave, having talked to some of the other guys in the space, I've been surprised by some of their responses about the IAB certification. I honestly don't remember the details, but I've heard things like, well, we don't even want to do that. That wouldn't even be beneficial. And I got quite confused at this point. And I'd love to hear your point of view about, how this really all racks up and why someone might have that point of view and just.
Well, one of the big downsides for getting IAB certified, if I were to speak candidly, is that it costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time, right? Yeah. And so as a startup, with limited time and limited funds, it was a risk that we took to do it. And that said, I'm sure a lot of the people that are speaking highly about IAB certification have a certification, and a lot of people that speak less highly don't have one. So you might expect that there is some bias entering the picture here. However, like I said, it was a much more rigorous process than I thought, and it ends up what you really want, because it's been so lacking in this industry for such a long time, is at least for everyone to agree on some definition of what the ground rules are. What's a download, right? Yeah. And it turns out it's a really complicated question because of what we talked about before. Because what's a download from your Android app when you're in your car versus your smart speaker versus any of the other zillion ways. Like if you're on an airplane, they have podcasts in the seat backs now, right? Like how is that counted the same way, right? Like there are challenges in this medium that don't exist in other media because it is decentralized, and I think it's good that we can at least all try to agree on what a download means, because otherwise, like, and y'all have been in this business for longer than I have, I'm sure you've had the conversation about what it means over and over and over again, and we're still having it, but hopefully over time we'll have it less. For us, we wanted to do it because as a newcomer in the space, we wanted to show the industry, both publishers and advertisers, that we take the data stuff really, really seriously. And you don't just have to take our word for it, right? So, that was part of the decision making going into it. The guidelines are imperfect. They released these download guidelines at the end of 2017, if I remember correctly. They're imperfect, but they are much, much better than what you would do if you didn't have them. Even though some folks implement there's like some open-ended kind of portions of the guidelines, it should give advertisers some feeling of certainty as to like what the download means when they get it.
So Dave, you know that I know Carl because he actually started at Oxford Road, really passionate in what was, effectively our mailroom program, and he's become a force in the industry, right? And I'm talking to him about, he's amazing. So I'm talking to him about Chartable, and I'm like, where's the chart? Like, you're Chartable, come on. And you guys finally did it, which I know that you gotta, and probably everybody wants to kill you the minute you put that out, or at least 99% of the ecosystem. But tell us about that chart. Like, there's PodTrack, there's Apple iTunes, which everybody knows means very little about actual consumption, right? Like, how's your chart different, and are any of them accurate, and why is it all over the place?
Yeah, it's all over the place. Again, it keeps coming back to the structure of the ecosystem, right? The structure is that, like, if like YouTube, for example, you can go to YouTube video and see how many views it has, right? Because Google owns YouTube, they own the server, they own the website, you press play, they count it, right? Podcasting just isn't like that, and isn't going to be like that unless Spotify has its way. And so we put out a top 200 chart. We do it once a week. The reason we decided to do it is because we think that the industry deserves to have charts that are transparent about how they measure, that release more frequently than once a month, and that aren't so focused on just the top 10, right? Because the PodTrack charts, which have been around for a long time and are quoted in a lot of places, they don't update all that frequently, and they're really heavily biased towards the very top publishers, which, like, most publishers are not the top publishers, right? And there's plenty of small shows out there that have incredibly engaged, passionate audiences that advertisers and marketers should be interested in, and they're never going to appear on one of those charts, right? And so we wanted to offer a different lens into the industry that's going to shine a light on more of these audiences that are out there, and more of the shows that are out there, and to do it on a cadence that's more than once a month, because things change pretty fast, and we thought that the industry needed something a little bit more frequent.
All right, so there's millions of podcasts out there now, right? We all have a podcast. Everybody has a podcast now, and one of the things that's interesting is maybe somewhere between 100 and 1,000 of them really drive the consumption in the industry. What do you where's the cliff on that, do you think, for if we're going to look at the 80-20 rule?
That's a really good question. Podcasts are, the stat term for it is like a fat-headed distribution, meaning that, like, most of the consumption happens at the very, very top. But that said, there's a really long tail, and I would guess that it's probably, I don't know where you want to draw the line, but, like, 80-20 is probably right.
Well, let's look at it. Well, I don't know if that's true, because that would mean hundreds of thousands are, meaningful
Yeah, I guess
in
that's
terms
fair.
of scale.
Yeah.
So
It's
let
gotta be,
me
like,
put it
much
a different
smaller
way.
than that. Yeah.
Dave, let me put it a different way. So
Yeah.
as a marketer, when we're buying a podcast, like, you don't really look at anything that's under 20,000, and 50,000 is kind of a threshold where you go, okay, they've got an audience, right? How many are in that 50,000 plus, do you think?
That's a really good question. I really wish I could probably like run some stats and get back to you on it. But because like I'm the kind of nerd here. He's not pulling numbers out of my sheep grazing.
Your pasture, right? It's
my pastures.
Yeah, right.
But there's probably not that many, right? It's probably a small number. But that said, I mean, like, ultimately, that 50,000 number, I mean, that matters to you guys because it's just a pain to buy on a lot of shows, right?
Well, and you always want to know, what am I missing? And like the promise of podcasts, like every marketer, I think, is trained from, day one on the job that it's like, it's all about targeting, right? And so you go, hey, I'm selling auto insurance, so why don't we advertise on all of the auto insurance podcasts? And it's like, well, that's because there's 75 of them and 2 listeners between the 75, right?
Right.
And so trying to figure out where's the cutoff point to where it's really worth your time, where you can really drive behavior, is interesting. And I think we're all trying to approximate how many are really worth finding and doing business with. But
sure.
it's messy. So in terms,
I think it really depends on the advertiser also. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but like,
no, please.
Like ultimately, like, for example, if you're, depending on how niche the product is, like a really niche show of like 1,000 listeners could be totally fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
But like for mainstream stuff like auto insurance, right? It's like, I think that, the cutoff would end up being a lot higher, right?
Yeah.
And one of the challenges is just that, like, even finding the shows is so hard, right? Which is what we're trying to do. But then also buying is hard. There's so much, like, every step of the way of like trying to do podcast advertising can be really frustrating, especially for folks who have never done it before, which is why, folks like you guys have such great businesses here, because you're helping to guide folks in the right direction,
Well, we're very fortunate that we have millions of people listening to this podcast.
Yes.
But I do worry about the others. So how much of the industry are you actually able to get visibility on? Like when you're doing the top 200, how much of that 80% of the consumption do you think you guys are capturing?
That's a good question. We work with like a good chunk of the top publishers, but right now the charts are opt-in. So there's folks that we work with that aren't on the charts, right? Because they've, somebody high up hasn't decided to do it yet, right? Ultimately from like an aggregate data perspective, we have a lot more information than we're able to reveal just through the charts currently. That said, like one of our long-term goals is to end up modeling the entire industry such that even if folks don't participate in our charts, that we should be able to give like a reasonable guesstimate of the audience of that show. So that, and we'll see. I mean, maybe it won't work. Maybe people will end up hating us.
It's thankless work. It is thankless work. The minute you publish something like that, you're going to piss off at least as many people as you're making happy,
tough.
right?
I mean, as nice as everybody is in this business, they're also really mad half the time, right?
So it's like, humans.
Yeah, humans. Yeah, but like for any other medium, there's just like a way to get insight, right? Well, one of the things that always baffles me about the Podtrack chart is that Joe Rogan isn't on there, right? That's weird.
Who's
right?
Joe Rogan?
Like, yeah, who's Joe Rogan? Yeah, Joe Spotify Rogan. I know that our charts are imperfect in so many ways, but we're trying to be as transparent as we can, and then over time, as we're able to like build out more functionality, we're going to try to thread the needle of like offering more info without pissing everyone off.
Right. Yeah. Good luck.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
So a question from me about privacy. Obviously, with CCPA this year, it's a big, scary thing that I think a lot of marketers don't necessarily understand particularly well. So perhaps you could speak a little bit to that. Like if people are considering attribution, should they be concerned? Shouldn't they be concerned? How have you guys dealt with it? And this is a great opportunity for you to tell us how, I'm sure you've got a solution that protects them from any potential legal exposure, but
For sure.
it's a big issue for marketers, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about your perspective on it.
Yeah, for sure. It's a big issue across like all media, and
Sure.
podcasting is no exception, right? I think that what's interesting about the way that the podcast industry has responded to it is that some folks have tried to like scare up, kick up a lot of dust around this stuff. But ultimately, from our perspective, like these are new rules that businesses must comply with, and therefore we will comply with them, right? Because we're a business and we want to like keep being a business.
Want to obey
right?
the law?
Yeah, pretty simple, right? It's like there's really not not a lot of like gray area there. Like so when the regulations were proposed, and then as they've been revised. So if you want to talk about gray area, the gray area is like there's like weird Microsoft Word redline PDFs on this California Attorney General's website that they release every so often. Those are weird and gray areas. But the broad outlines of the law are pretty straightforward. There's like obligations that businesses have to consumers, and we will fulfill those obligations, right? And that in the attribution context, there's obligations that we have. There's obligations that hosting companies have, so the companies that are actually serving up the ads or the media files. And there's obligations that the advertisers have. We're all compelled under the law to give consumers the right, various rights that they can exercise, whether that's to not sell their information or to delete their information. And there are plenty of ways to get great attribution that comply with the law, right? And that's what we do. There might be some additional paperwork that needs to be done, depending on the integration, on the advertiser side. Like we've seen some folks have like more, their legal teams might get more involved just to be sure that like, we're checking all the boxes, et cetera. But for the most part, it's pretty straightforward. There are some new rules and we follow them, and that's that, right? We have we went through a strong compliance effort. You can go to our website and either fill out our CCPA request form or call our toll-free number, which was one of the original requirements of the law, and leave a message, and I literally will listen to it and call you back. So please don't do that.
This is your cell phone number?
That's great.
Yeah, straight to my cell phone.
You've just told that to millions of people, Dave. I don't know if you realize.
Millions of people, feel free to call our privacy hotline and leave me a message. It does not go to my cell phone, thankfully. But ultimately, I'm not going to say it's like, oh, it's so simple. Like it's a complex law. There's complex rules, but we follow them. And when there's new advice, we talk to our lawyers. Like if there's new regulations, and we'll follow those too. That's like, we just got to play by the rules of the game, right? And as the rules change, like we'll also change what we do.
Do you have prospects who want better measurement and they're interested in your product, but they feel that they can't participate due to privacy concerns? Like how do you deal with
less of a problem with
marketers who are very
CCPA and more like GDPR is a tough one.
Guys, we're going heavy on the acronyms. Please give
the
context.
GDPR is the European privacy regulation. The big difference from where I sit, and I'm sure lawyers that have a lot of different things to say about it, is that the GDPR is a opt-out thing, meaning that like if you want to do something with somebody's data, they have to opt in rather, and CCPA is opt-out. So like if a consumer in California wants to opt out of us doing something, they can do that. But in the EU, they have to give consent for us to perform any kind of stuff with their data. And so we can't really do what we normally do with attribution in the EU. We don't feel like we have a strong legal position there. So we don't. And so if things change, like if that became the norm in the US, then like we'd have to change what we do. But for now, we just comply with the rules that are there.
Sure. And I mean, when you think about podcast measurement generally, how do you see the future panning out? Like, and partially when I ask that, I'm thinking about the sort of the broader world of attribution, MTA solution providers, those types of guys. Like, is that part of the future, or does it look different? Like, you obviously have your own roadmap. I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question because, like, ultimately, I think marketers are not necessarily going to want a different tool for every new medium that comes along.
Right.
At the same time, various new media might have challenges. Like podcasting is such a unique medium and it does require a specialized tool right now, right? In the long term, I do expect more of the multi-touch attribution providers that work across different platforms to, hopefully they'll partner with us, or perhaps we'll expand to include them. Podcasting for most advertisers is just a portion of the media that they're buying.
Mm-hmm.
But like even without those integrations right now, like as it stands right now, that's why we keep going back to this incremental lift thing. It's like you can isolate your podcast effect, and we think that's really important. But we also offer, we want to work with as many folks as possible, and so we offer data exports. Again, it depends on the agreements that folks have with the publisher, and of course we have to comply with privacy regulations, et cetera, but there's ways to work with different tool sets.
Dave, how big do you think the podcast universe is? How many people listen to podcasts, international and domestic? As if that's knowable.
Yeah, really good question. So one of the ways I think about this is trying to size like how many downloads there are in the world on a monthly basis. And that's different than the number of people downloading. But like if you look at Podtrac's top 10 or Podtrac's numbers, they say they do like 1.2 billion a month. We do like 700 million a month, and there's some overlap there. So the question is, it's like there are 2 or 3 billion maybe downloads a month, or is it more like 1.5 billion? Is the US like so dominant? I'm guessing that there's like huge pockets of listening that because we're US based and have like the US has the most developed podcast ad market. That's where we spend a lot of our time. There's a lot of stuff happening internationally, and it wouldn't necessarily hit the radar screens of folks in the US. So how many folks are listening? Like, the Edison number is like a third of the US public.
Mm-hmm.
But like a lot of folks are probably like streaming Rogan on YouTube, right? And does that count as a podcast listen? I don't know. I guess they're not going to be able to do that pretty soon.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they found a great way to solve that.
Yeah, exactly. There's a solution for that problem. It's like, to go back to the messiness, it's like what counts as a podcast, right? And there's so much basis in radio too. Like NPR is huge in podcasting, but it's also huge on radio. And like, what's the pipeline of people going back and forth there?
So Dave, I know that I don't know if you read the news, but there's a crisis going on in this country right now, and
there's nothing behind me. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So, how do you think listenership has changed?
So we ran some numbers and we saw a pretty steep drop in the initial that week the NBA closed down. We saw like a drop in the numbers that we were tracking, and I was honestly pretty terrified by it. But since then, I've kind of looked back at it and saw that it really wasn't as steep, and it hasn't been permanent. And more than that, the engagement, the listeners that are listening super deeply. And that to me is like one of the key metrics there. And that's why like when people talk about like the podcast audience numbers, or the number of downloads compared to like, for example, YouTube views, they're not even really equivalent, right? Like when people spend so much time with podcasts, and that's why the advertising is so powerful. And people are still doing that. They're listening to hours of audio. And when they choose to put on a podcast now, especially because they don't have a commute, they are really listening. And so we see the ad response rates have held up quite well. And so my initial panic was maybe not totally justified.
Well, but like, let's break it down into practical terms. So take this podcast, which has a weekly unique audience of 10 million listeners, right?
Right.
But we were born
in
this after this interview, definitely. So, so if you go back, but we started in the crisis. But if you had just say 100,000 listeners in February, okay, where are you probably at today? Just break it down.
It really depends on the show and on the genre. You're probably back to where you were, if not higher. That's where I'd see it. But
and are you seeing shifts in terms of what they're listening to?
I feel like so. I'm probably going to end up if I listen back to this, which I will, because it's quality content. I'm probably going to end up sounding like I'm hedging a lot, but that's because like I think what we want out of the crisis, like there's a desire for a clean narrative, right? Mm-hmm. That like, okay, sports are down. right? Like they must be because there's no sports. Well, some shows are actually doing really well. They found ways to really pivot, right? So saying all sports are down doesn't really reflect like the reality. But like overall, I would expect that most things are doing better. We saw that some things got hit more than others, but again, that's a pretty broad brush. Comedy was doing pretty well. Kids and family was doing better than normal. You would think that news would be doing well, but it was like unequally distributed. Like coronavirus podcasts were doing really great, but that doesn't mean that every news podcast was doing great. Right?
Interesting.
But now people are kind of burnt out of the coronavirus stuff, right? So that bump in traffic that folks were seeing around coronavirus related content is kind of worn off because our attention spans can only handle so much.
Right.
News,
we're moving towards escapism. It's like, what's going on? What's going on? Don't talk about that anymore. I don't want to hear it.
Oh, that's why I think like comedy, it makes sense to me as a human who wants narratives. It makes sense to me that comedy has done well throughout this time and that there's a narrative around that. And that we saw that in the numbers too.
So the business, everybody's excited about getting to $1 billion and they're talking about it 2021. Some people are saying 2020. Do you think this slows down the industry's ability to get there?
I was hoping it would be this year. It may not be, right? And that's not really tied to podcasting in particular. It's like ad buying across all media has been disrupted in these uncertain and unprecedented times, right?
Are they unprecedented?
Yeah, there's without, and when times become more precedented again, I think like ultimately I don't think it's going to change the overall trajectory of the industry. It's just going to be a dip and the curve is going to look the same. So maybe it pushes out that $1 billion number like 6 months later than it would have been otherwise, but I don't think that it changes the way that people interact with this medium and the way that people listen and the way that people buy, because like it's
the habits aren't that different.
Yeah. I mean, like, okay, I don't have a commute, but like as soon as I do, right. Like I actually like thought, I mean, I used to take the train into the city here. And like that was like the majority of my podcast listening time, and I've lost that, but I've replaced it now with my walks like that I do to try to stay sane, right? And so I wasn't listening a lot in the initial weeks of these unprecedented times, but I have found ways to carve out more listening again. And as soon as I have that commute time back, I guarantee you I'm going to open up that purple podcast app or the green one and get right back into it, Absolutely.
Okay. So we're going to take a little break. And when we come back, we're going to talk to Dave about his top 10 habit hacks. He just leaked one of them to figure out how he's functioning through the crisis and staying sane and productive in the process. So before that, I need your help. And I'm asking you, the listener or the viewer, I need your help with something. One of the things that's been really hard on humans, on people in the COVID-19 crisis is that it separates the people that are suffering from the families and loved ones that might be able to support them in that time, literally physically, where you've got somebody who's in the hospital and their family can't even spend time with them because they have to distance. This is actually not a new problem. It's just more pronounced with coronavirus. But this happens every day at children's hospitals across the country, but across the world, where you have these kids with life-threatening illnesses alone in bed who are too young to go walk around or do something and really, aren't at a place to just turn on the TV. And so oftentimes you have them alone and unattended to because nobody can be there all the time. I went through this personally when our youngest daughter was born with life-threatening medical issues. And we were in Children's Hospital for 6 months, and we were there like 90 some, hopefully 99% of the time. But when you can't, it breaks your heart. And we saw this happening to kids everywhere with working parents, single parents. And it's a real problem. So my wife and I vowed to do something about it. And led by my wife, we launched the Koala Corps to solve this problem for good. The Koala Corps' mission is to bring hands to hold every child in need. And the tragedy of the situation today is that there are plenty of volunteers who want to help with this. But usually there's not enough funding to actually have somebody run the program so that they can recruit, screen, train, and manage the volunteers to get the comfort to these kids that they need so badly. So the funds that we are raising for Koala Corps go straight to Children's Hospital, to the staff that is required to solve this problem, to bridge this gap. And we need your help to solve it. Koala Corps doesn't touch any money. We don't have any costs associated with it. We just provide a platform for you to give directly to Children's Hospital, and it goes straight to this fund. And so the way to do that is to go to koalacorps.com. That's KOALACORPS.com, and give what you can today. So thanks for considering that. If you found this interview helpful, please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please visit oxfordroad.com to subscribe to The Influencer, which is our weekly newsletter for industry updates and thought leadership. Okay, now let's get back to our conversation with Dave. It's a very special time in the show where we're going to get into the top 10 habit hacks, where we're going to rapid fire questions at you, Dave. And you're just going to tell us how you're managing your life in this and see if we can get some personal tips for you. And the one warning that I have is, one of the 17 producers we have on this show is Kyle, and he's with us, and he has a bell. So if you go too long in your answer, he's going to hit the bell, and you do not want that to happen. It is horribly distracting. Yeah. So are you ready? Are you geared up?
Yeah, I'm going to do this.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Okay.
Dave, what time do you get up in the morning?
6 or 6:30.
Do you have a morning and nighttime ritual? And if so, what do you do?
The morning is about the kids, right? It's not really about me. I got 2 little kids at home.
Isn't it all about the kids?
It is.
Right.
Get up, breakfast, cereal, read a book, that kind of stuff before getting to work. Nighttime, they go to bed pretty early, so we just have actually a little bit of time to spend with my wife, which is fantastic, and then read a little bit and go to bed. That's it. Nothing exciting.
Okay. And how much time is spent on internal versus external meetings when you're working?
Most of our meetings are external. As a company, we don't do a lot of internal meetings. We try to limit them. We try to communicate as asynchronously as possible, which has served us pretty well amid the crazy that's happening right now.
Got you. Do you schedule your breaks?
I'm fortunate that most days I have large chunks of uninterrupted time, which I need to actually do the technical work that I do. So often I'll be able to go, get a run in there or do some exercise. But if I have a really scheduled day, I'll block off an hour here or there.
And how much of your time is spent in meetings versus doing work?
I try to bundle my meetings into 2 days a week if possible. Obviously, external meetings, you don't always get to choose. So I try to have most of my meetings Mondays or Thursdays, and those are really packed. And then the rest of the time I have mostly free. So Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday are almost entirely unscheduled.
All right. What do you do to stay sane?
I'm not sure that I am, but what I try to do is I try to go for at least one long walk a day. And then, having that extra time during the day, being home all day, getting that little chunks of time with the kids unscheduled is like a real mood lifter. The rest of the time, it's just about, trying to stay active, exercise, try not to drown my sorrows in drink.
Dave, what are you streaming right now?
On TV, we're watching Succession on HBO, which is media focused, which is funny. So it's not that much of a break. I love cooking shows. So there's a new season of Top Chef. It's for me, cooking shows are the ultimate kind of I'm not thinking about work. I'm not thinking about code or podcasts. Podcast wise, I love the super nerdy podcast called Conversations with Tyler, which is focused on economics. I just find it fascinating. And that's what I listen to on my long walks every day.
And when you listen to podcasts, what speed do you listen to them at?
I used to be a high-speed listener, but now I'm back at 1x, man.
Really? Why change?
Well, most of the stuff I listen to now, Conversations with Tyler and this Andreessen Horowitz podcast is from a venture capital firm in SF, they're really fast. So listening to them like at faster than 1x, it just like stresses me out because like it's fast. It's kind of fast enough at 1x. I would maybe go 1.1. But yeah, for the slower stuff, I definitely speed up to 1.25 at least.
I recommend to our listeners that they listen to this at 2x.
Carl listens at 3x sometimes, apparently.
Yeah, he's a madman, of course.
He's a madman.
Yeah. Okay. All right. One new habit you've introduced since work from home orders went into effect.
One, I'm not sure that I have one. I wish I could say that I did. Maybe it's just the walk. Like I would get, I live in New York. We had just moved out of the city right before the pandemic. So like my whole schedule was like totally changed and life was put upside down anyway. And then this happened. So like my like nature walk that I do every day is my new thing. And I really am finding it sane making where possible.
Yeah. So very helpful, very good answers. And somehow you didn't get the bell. I don't know if Kyle is struggling or if the bell is broken. Yeah. But look at that! You made it.
You got the bell.
I got the bell. Yeah, no, he'll torture me with this for sure. Yeah. Okay, let's get back to business. So I know we're running out of time here.
I've got a little time if you've got time, so it's up to you.
Sure, we'll just give another 5 minutes or so. How's that? So one question I have is, with everything changing in the world, do you think that anything has changed that's going to stick?
Like worldwide or with podcasts?
Let's stick with podcasts.
I don't know that much is going to stick. I mean, like, I think that, when we talk about going back to normal or whatever, it's going to be a slow kind of like weirdo process that is different depending on where you are, what state you're in, and how bad it is, right? But what we're already seeing in the numbers and what I expect to continue seeing is that as people are on the move more, that time that they had in their day to listen that was determined by their commutes or being in transit is going to come back, and they're going to go right back to the podcasts, right? So you're already seeing that, and I expect that to continue.
Well, I'm just going to ask a question about something which is important to us as an agency for sure, is the voice space. And obviously, there appears to be convergence sort of potentially happening, but I'm still, until recently at least, not a lot of podcast listening was happening on smart speakers, for example, but I know that that's increased since COVID. But how are you guys thinking about that? Obviously, there's a lot of shift for audio content coming in the future.
Yeah, we think about it like, we don't have pod in our name, and that was on purpose, right? Because when we thought about this industry, we thought about it as like, audio is a spectrum of different devices and different kinds of content. That said, the smart speaker thing, it has grown, during the pandemic, but it grew from a pretty small base from a podcast perspective, right? So there's this massive, adoption of the device, but most people don't use it for much except for clock radio right now. And I think that's really up to...
With Ask Jeeves and a thermometer.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Like the best clock radio you've ever had, right?
Yes.
But like, I think it's really on Google and Amazon and the others that have these devices to make it easier to do something other than ask what time it is, right? Because like there's so many user interface challenges with like dealing with these smart speakers that like, I'm a pretty technically adept person, right? But I find Alexa to be infuriating like 40% of the time, right? So like, if that's the case for me, then it must be much worse for people who are not like, don't have the patience for tech that I do, right? And so I would expect that it'll get better. It's just going to be slower than I want it to be, because there's tens or hundreds of millions of these devices out in the world. They're sitting there, they're speakers, they're connected to the internet. Somebody could play a podcast on them, obviously, but until it gets easier to do so, I think it's going to be tough. Are
you tracking listenership across those different devices?
Yeah, we don't break it out on a regular basis. I have looked at it. We should probably start breaking it out on a regular basis. It has gone up, but again, like Google Podcasts has had a bigger growth than just the Google Home speaker in general. So,
Dave, I want to ask you about creative, but I don't know if you touch it or view it in any way. Do you guys get visibility into what's working and what's not from a creative asset?
Yes, we do, although that is not what I personally spend my time on. So I don't know that I can speak all that deeply to it. But
would you have any advice for marketers that are with us that are trying to figure out, how do I navigate this phase of my message given everything that's going on?
Yeah, I think that when it comes down to it, I think that everybody's feeling like the question of whether they should address the pandemic or not. And that's why I feel like when I see TV commercials these days, there's so many like dark voiceovers and say, America's seen better days and we're going to help you by offering you no payments. And like, I don't know that's
really good, by the way. Somebody's going to use that in an ad. Yeah.
I'm sure that's appropriate for a number of brands, but there's a lot of brands for whom it's not appropriate. Right. And so I don't think that it's necessary for everybody to address the pandemic when they're doing an ad. A lot of times, we're going back to the escapist point. It's like when I'm listening, I don't want to be reminded of the pandemic every 5 seconds, right?
Right.
So like it doesn't necessarily, but like, obviously I think it just really depends on the brand, but like podcasts are a chance for folks to embrace like what the hosts are doing, right? If you're buying host read ads, and I think it's another chance for the hosts to help determine some of the tone there.
Are you tracking with the evolution of performance marketers to brand marketers by composition in the channel? Because, when we got in, it was all performance, right? It's all D2C brands, right? And now you've got big names coming in. What do you know about that? Can you share any stats?
So we still, from where we sit, primarily work with performance marketers, just given the tech that we have. It's like slightly less appropriate for brand folks. But what we've seen is that like because ad budgets are in flux everywhere, attribution becomes more important during these kind of like times of uncertainty. It's like, okay, if I am going to be buying ads, I want to make sure that they're working. And so that kind of like leans towards performance marketing, right? So we've seen like a doubling down from the performance side, at least with regard to our business. I don't know if I can speak to the business as a whole.
So here's a question that you're either going to really regret or really be proud of your answer to, which is 5 years from today. Paint a picture. What is podcast? Is it still podcast? Is it audio? Is it radio? Like, does it all blend together? What does the future look like?
It's a great question. And I'm going to bookmark this and see how I did. I think that like people in the industry tend to get hung up on the definition of what a podcast is or isn't. I think that we take a holistic view. Like it's audio, right? It solves a problem that somebody has, whether that problem is I'm bored or I want to be entertained or I want to learn. And they don't particularly, listeners don't particularly care which app they get it from, as long as it's decent enough. It's not about the app. It's about the content. It's about laughing. It's about learning. It's about whatever it is I'm coming to that show for. And so I would expect that there will be much more audio consumption. I don't know whether it'll be technically a podcast, because like people say technically a podcast that has to have an RSS feed. Spotify is going to change that for a huge swath of the market. I would expect that YouTube, Google, the other big tech companies, hopefully Apple is roused from its slumber and does something interesting and exciting in podcasting. I think it's going to be different. Audio will be more ubiquitous. Hopefully one of those smart speaker manufacturers will crack the UI challenges on making it easier to listen to something other than what time it is and a timer.
Okay, so imagine a chart that has, or a line graph that has the growth of consumption or the audience, hours spent listening, and then another line that has the growth of the volume of shows available, and another line that has revenue. Because I'm leading you, but I'm going to tell you what I think, which is that we're making shows faster than we're making listeners.
For sure.
And the revenue projections for the industry are predicated on the investment going into production, but that it's not growing as fast as everything else. So what's your perspective on that, and what are the implications?
Yeah, I think, when we say that there's 1 million podcasts, like most of those are like people putting out like 1 or 2 episodes on some free hosting platform, right? Mm-hmm. Like the actual subset of shows that like are professionally produced podcasts is much, much smaller. It's still pretty large. To go back to your earlier question of like how many shows have 50,000 downloads, it's like more than a handful, less than 1 million, right? Mm-hmm. But those are the shows that matter. The people that are trying to build, like at least for the context of this question, the people that are trying to build a business, sell advertising. And there's probably more being made more quickly than ad dollars are coming in. However, audio, if you look at the overall trends of media and the history of media, like podcasting is just way under monetized per minute of attention than any other medium, period. It's crazy, right? And there's a lot of reasons why that is, at like every step of the chain, right? It's still like, compared to TV, it's niche, right? It's still hard to buy ads. Like you have to know what you're doing. You have to like go through all the work to buy on different platforms. You have to get an attribution vendor. You have to do X, Y, and Z. There's a zillion different things. That'll all get easier over time. And as people, do more and more larger campaigns, as the reach gets bigger, brands are going to be more comfortable allocating more dollars to podcasting. And I think that trend is going to continue. I would imagine that it'll accelerate.
But if you're an advertiser in podcasts today, does that mean that your value that you're able to derive from the channel is going to diminish over time?
If something is working, it's going to get more competitive, right? I mean, it used to be the case that Facebook ads were really cheap. Google ads used to be really cheap.
They're getting cheaper again, I think.
Yeah, they're cheaper, during the pandemic. But, because there's so few accessible channels out there, like, Google and Facebook control something like 2/3 of all digital advertising dollars, right? And so those channels tend to get really competitive. And if podcasting right now has an edge in terms of being like, it's like slightly less well known, and so therefore you can get a good acquisition cost from a performance perspective. The more people find out about that, it's of course also going to get more competitive, right?
Yeah.
But that's how the game works, right? And you've been in this business a long time. I'm sure you've seen it more than I have.
Okay, so I want to get some more advice out of you before we go. So, the audience here is really brands and marketers, but every citizen now has a podcast. It's part of the American dream, right?
Yes,
and so what advice do you have for people who have a podcast or launching a podcast to build their audience?
It's a great question. The easiest way is to have an audience already somewhere else. But if you don't, even if you have a small business or something, leveraging the other channels that you have, like whether that's a social media following or an email newsletter, a YouTube channel, anything you got, it's all about kind of cross-promoting across those different channels. We happen to offer some wonderful tools to help you track the performance of your different channels at driving listeners to your podcast. So you should definitely check those out if you want to. But if you're serious about building an audience, know that there's no silver bullets, right? It takes time. It takes dedication. Podcasting is a long form medium, and the audiences grow over time. Like when people subscribe to a show, like that's your chance to be in their feed, to be in front of them or in their ears over a long period of time. So it's like, it does reward that kind of patient audience building in a way that like kind of the quick flash of like viral tweets or something does not.
So Dave, I'm a marketer. I'm watching or listening to this podcast, and I am trying to figure out how to either get in or expand on what I'm doing. What advice do you have for me?
I think that a lot of folks get into podcasting maybe without thinking about it all too much, and that's okay. I mean, that is the American dream, is to do things without thinking about them all too much.
Don't laugh, Giles. It'll sound like you're mocking us.
Yeah. But I think a little bit of thought and planning goes a long way here. Like if you're serious about doing this, like podcasts take time, audience building takes time, and it has great rewards if you're willing to put in the time. So think about like what message you're trying to put out there. How many podcasts, like there's a lot of podcasts where people are either it's going to be a couple dudes in a basement talking about movies. There's a lot of podcasts like that. There's a few of them that are really successful. You need to think about like how your podcast with dudes in a basement talking about movies is going to be different or better than those.
Yeah.
And if it's about your business, like, there's probably you probably actually have a lot of expertise and content that people would care about. You just have to think about how it's going to get out there and how it's going to make a meaningful contribution to somebody's time. They're going to put in time to your podcast. What are they going to get out of it? What problem is it solving for them? What job is it doing for them?
So one thing that I have observed in dealing with, hundreds of brands that have come into the channel and then scaled in the channel, trying to look for common denominators on what separates those that test from those that scale. Analytics is not a strategy, right? And data is not what you can grow without doing any of that work. But I find that if you don't get past that checkpoint, if you don't do the work to sort out attribution, you're really going to have an uphill battle at scaling the program. And, our position as an agency is just like, hey, we're agnostic. I think you can lose a lot of your objectivity if you go too far down one attribution path. But, it's important, in addition to the vanity URLs and the surveys, that you have a secondary way to check it. And so I think what you're doing is very important for marketers. There is no silver bullet. There never will be a silver bullet. We'll always be arguing about something. But it's still work that needs to be done. And so with that, of course. So for those that want to work with Chartable, what's your call to action here?
So go to chartable.com, enter promo code Oxford. Just kidding. Go to chartable.com.
In these uncertain times?
In these uncertain times, in these better days, America will come together. We're here. You can check out what we have to offer, but you can also just reach out to me directly. It's dave@chartable.com.
Oh boy.
That's my email address.
Wow.
You can call my toll-free privacy number.
Yes. But that just gets your personal answering machine, right?
Yeah. It's a very special answering machine. Yeah.
Dave, this has been a lot of fun, and I appreciate you going along with us here.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, of course.
Some of the best questions I've had.
Good.
Really thoughtful. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Okay, so for show notes from this interview and curated media news, please visit oxfordroad.com, subscribe to our newsletter, The Influencer, and you'll get industry updates and thought leadership and wonderful links to episodes like this. Special thanks to Bianca, to Kyle, to Jennifer, and to our special guest, Giles, for helping make all this happen. Please remember to subscribe on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you liked it, leave us a review. And if you don't have something nice to say, then, you can email us. Yeah, then...
Email dan@oxfordroad.com.
Yeah, correct. Email dave@chartable.com. And above all else, never, never, never give up.